thank you. It's great to be back in India. This is actually my third trip. The first one was 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, and I can actually say this is my first international trip since the pandemic. So India holds a special place now because it's become the bookend before and after for travel for me. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. The one thing, though, that I want to start with is about the culture. And that's the one thing that I've really loved about being out here, is learning about the culture here. And the one thing that really caught my attention right off the bat was namaste. And I love the greeting, so namaste. Now, in the interest of cultural exchange, I just learned last month, as my son is now going off to university, we had his orientation. And when we got to the campus, he is now going to Texas A&M University. If you haven't noticed, I'm not necessarily from around here. But from Texas, that's a big thing. And when I got to Texas A&M and we went to the orientation, I learned about their culture. And they have something similar to namaste. It's actually howdy. Now, in the interest of cultural exchange, I'm going to say howdy to you, and you can say it back to me, because that's what they taught us at orientation. So, howdy. Excellent. You are now all honorary Texans. So, really, the reason I brought that up is that culture is actually the underlying piece of the whole concept of people, process, and technology. I had an interview with a CHR at one of our customers, and as I presented him this kind of concept of people, process, and technology, he said, "You're missing a point." He said, "You need to talk about culture." I said, "You're absolutely right." And so that's why I wanted to bring this up at the very beginning, because the culture of our organizations, every culture is going to be different, and it's going to impact how well you actually can implement changes in your people, process, technology, procedures. So I will say this. It's 2020. It's not necessarily the roaring 20s. We're also not living necessarily in the Jetsons world, which we thought we would actually be living in by now. By the way, fun fact, July 31st, 2020, so just a few days ago, was George Jetson's birthday. He was born on that day. So we're only about 40 years away from that. But the reason I bring this up is that from a contextual perspective, when we look at what's happening because of the pandemic, because of all the changes we've had, we've actually gotten to the point where we're not living in the Jetsons world. We're living like this. We're quite exhausted. We've had a lot of changes. But it's also important to look at how these changes can be made to actually make things better. And when I use this particular paradigm of people, process, and technology, there is a sweet spot where they overlap. And we're going to go through each of these just to talk about the components of them. But when we look at where they are, there's overlaps when it comes to people, the idea of efficient processes and leverage technology, or when process and technology come together, the optimization. If you can achieve all these, you will ultimately have a solid employee experience. And that's what we're looking at from a lot of the software that we use. We want to have something people will use and leverage over and over again. So I was sitting in the room when one of the former speakers was talking, and I was like, he's talking about people and technology. He's talking about the same thing. So I'm either aligned or I'm just copying, but I think we're aligned in what we're happening here. So let's first talk about people. Well, the last few years, things have changed. We look at how people view work now. The idea that work is the center of our lives is a little different. We've seen with the Great Resignation, people leaving their jobs. People have decided that they're not going to put up with the daily commutes. The idea of remote work has actually become much more appealing to a lot of people. But what we've found is that that shift in how people view their job, their role in what they do, is having an impact on the other two components, the process and the technology. When it comes to process, we'll look at how that now shifts with remote work or with the way things have changed from pandemic. Technology, it's in more demand than ever. So when we look at the people, we have to look first at where is their center of the universe. Well, the second part is how do employers view the people? We've seen the idea of human capital. It's not necessarily a warm, fuzzy term, but the idea now of employees and their wellness or the retention aspect, that's now very much part of what they want to have. They want to look at employees more as someone they need to keep. They want to train, skill development. We're hearing all those things. So those play into the concept of the people. But when you think about overall technology, it's the way that now these companies are pulling people together. We have the remote employees. We have Teams meetings, virtual employees. I can tell you that one of the things that's come out of the last year was I actually hired 4 professionals, onboarded them, and now manage them virtually. I've never met any of them in person. That's a very different approach to managing people, to dealing with people in an organization, to create a team environment. It's been tough, but I will tell you that I'm looking very much forward to being able to get together with them in person, because I do think from a people perspective, we do need that connection. There's an opportunity to have deeper connections with your team members when you can get together in person. So that's people. Well, let's talk about process. The first thing is, who can raise their hand and say all the processes in your organization are mapped and you have them in a library? Anybody? No, didn't think so. So when you think about the processes, first of all, when you think about the way that the pandemic operated, we suddenly had to throw most processes out and start doing things differently. I know when we think about the beginning of 2020, all of a sudden everything changed rapidly. One of the organizations I used to work for took an approach that I think is genius. I hated it at the time, but it was actually really smart. The organization demanded that we process map everything. And so they took the leaders in the organization and they sent us to process mapping training camp. We had 2 weeks of learning what the diamonds are, the squares are, the ovals. We learned all of that. SIPOCs, inputs, outputs, processes, all of that. It was really interesting for the first day, and it became a chore after that. But what happened from that was they trained us in that process mapping, and then they said, all right, now for the next month, you're going to go back to your department, and you're going to identify anything that is an output from your department, and you're going to backwards create the process. Again, it was arduous. I hated every moment of it. But the moment that I realized what was happening, it was like someone telling you to be on a better diet or go into a better health gym and such. I realized that at the end of this, we suddenly had every output that our departments needed mapped. We could understand that. That is valuable because what you can use with that is anytime you buy technology, anytime you're trying to look at an efficiency, optimization, you have a record of what it is. This is something that I would encourage every organization to take a look at and consider, because more than likely, most of your processes have shifted from 2020 to today. And the problem is most of us don't know which parts of it shifted. There are all sorts of process stories out there about concepts of one VP at one point in time said this has to be done this way. And that person is long gone, yet it still happens. That's why you have to look at your processes. And it's really important now in this post-pandemic world, hopefully it's post, that we're living in, that you do understand your processes, because you don't have time for bad process, for sloppy, inefficient process. You need to be tight, and that's where that efficiency comes from. So let's look at the last part, the technology. I love this for technology because it's, are you using the right tool for the job? And many times, people aren't necessarily using the right tool. It may be because they bought the tool thinking it was going to do things, but they didn't align themselves properly to it. This is where that process and technology overlap occurs. More often than not, both as a practitioner that I used to be, as well as on the vendor side, I've seen the dissatisfaction with technology relies on the fact that someone is probably not using the tool in the manner it was designed to be. A customer may have a 5-stage process, and it may very well have one of those VP extras added in that they've used for years and years and years. The technology can do that process in 2 steps, maybe 3. but they still demand that those 5 steps be done. That's the area of dissatisfaction. You have to make sure that as you're looking at your processes and aligning it with the technology was designed to be used in a specific way. It was designed for very much efficiencies. When you align your process and technology, that's that optimization that happens. So when it comes to the technology, what we found is in this realm of the pandemic, post-pandemic, we've seen the demand for technology become even greater than ever before. As we heard the speaker earlier talk about the idea of Star Trek and viewing each other on screens from different remote places, that's happening every single day. I've FaceTimed my wife and my children in the United States on a daily basis from here. We have Teams meetings with my virtual team. We don't think anything of it. But the reason we use it is because it's been almost consumerized. And that's the key with the technology, is the more it employs those consumer tendencies that we've come to adjust or to realize, whether it's Facebook, Amazon, or anything else, we use those because they're intuitive and we know how to use them. When you come to work, we're getting better. I mean, I remember the generation of when I was told to use something, it didn't necessarily work very well, but because the company bought it, I had to use it. Thankfully, we're now moving to a realm of where organizations understand that the employee experience is part of this, and the employees have more to say about the use of these tools. So when we think about technology, we have to think about the increased use of technology, but also the demand and the consumer tendencies that are driving it. Because if our people are at home, more than likely they're sitting right next to their personal computer, which is a Mac in some instances, or something that they've come to use very often, and they now have this side-by-side that they didn't necessarily have before. When you're at work, you expect certain things to be that way. But now that you can join these two in one location, you have different expectations. So, again, that's the technology. We've increased the demand of it, and we have higher expectations of it. So, as we look at going back to this sweet spot of the employee experience, now let's revisit these pieces. So when we have process, have you mapped those processes? Can you align them to the technology that's out there? If you do, you will optimize the use of that technology. You will have an efficient process that is not 5 steps trying to have a system that can do it in 2, doing it 2. You will have revised your processes down to those 2 to match the technology in those 2. And again, with the process and people, you want to make sure that the processes are efficient. We don't have time to wait for processes these days. Decisions have to be made almost in real time the way we operate. The world has changed in which things happen much, much faster. And so we have to make sure that with those processes, we think about how the people need to use them. Consider the remote work. Is a process tied to someone carrying a piece of paper down the hallway to another office? That didn't work any longer. That office may even not even be filled with people. So you have to come up with these new processes and think about that. But again, with the technology, is it consumer style, consumer based, so that people are leveraging it? The worst thing in the world is to buy a technology and have no one use it. And again, that's where we look at that leverage. So when you have your process aligned with your technology, and you have the process aligned with the people, and the people are leveraging that technology, that ends up at that sweet spot of the employee experience. It's where employees, users will want to go. They will leverage that technology that you have, whether it's learning or talent or HR, but they will start to use that, and that's when the ROI kicks in. When you have that opportunity to do that, that's when you now see the value in what's being done. But in this realm of reimagine, and I love the idea of reimagine, because it's something that I've seen for years. In fact, there's a book, I will give a side note. If you ever find Tom Peters' book, Reimagine, it's worth its weight in gold, but you got to get the audio version. It's a textbook in the way it looks. But this was written in 2003, and it is very much as apparent today as anything you'll ever see. And there's a quote that I've lived from ever since I read the book. And it says, if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevance even less. It's brilliant in its inception. Your irrelevance is if you're not going to change your process, not going to change your approach to technology, not going to change the way that you deal with your people. We now know that attrition is a problem. We want to keep people as much as possible, so let's find the ways to give them that employee experience. So ultimately, when we wrap this all together, you have the idea of this positive experience that employees will have. It's bottom line driven so that your organization gets the maximum value out of what your technology that you've purchased, but you keep the people. And your processes, hopefully you'll go out and do process mapping. Not necessarily through the arduous process that I went through, but take a look. What are those key processes? Start with the ones that you have to have first. What are the most critical? And how are they impacting your ability to respond to changing market conditions? That's the important part of what you have to do. But I will say, in kind of a early closing here, I did write a blog on this particular topic. You can go to my blog site, BRENTCOLESCOTT.com. And then from a maturity perspective, when we look at what organizations can do that are more digitally mature, savvy in what they have from an idea of people, process, and technology, we actually at SumTotal Systems have developed a diagnostic that's free. It has tons of information that you can get out of it, but more importantly, it will tell you about the maturity of your organization, the digital maturity of your organization. If you go to omi.sumtotalsystems.com, you can actually take this diagnostic, you get the output, nobody's going to call you right away. It's a great tool that we've developed over the last several years. Part of it is my role as a practitioner, but also to get that latest information in terms of how it impacts the world that we work in today. I appreciate your time today and thank you for your attention.